In other slides talking about how do individuals make decisions, we've talked about bounded rationality, we've talked about the rational economic model. Intuition tends to be the way a lot of people make decisions. Now, intuition sort of has this reputation of somehow being this out of thin air, this idea comes and strikes us on the head, and suddenly we have this new idea that we never know where it came from. Well, it's not quite that simplistic. In reality, because our brain is this really huge, complex computer, and our frontal cortex can only handle a few pieces of information, there's a lot of data processing that's going on in the other parts of the brain, cerebral cortex and things like that. So the frontal cortex can only do so much. So the other part of the brain is doing the processing, but what it does is that it sort of taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, I processed this while you were not thinking about it, and I got this really cool idea. I think you need to listen to me. So your intuition sort of shoves itself in there. It seems like it's out of thin air, but in fact it comes from past experience, sort of outside of consciousness. What it basically is your body and your brain is processing the decades and decades of information that it's been gathering, and it's trying to predict what's the best solution to the problem. And so because so much is going on in the unconscious part of our brain, and it's sort of bubbling up to the consciousness, we call it intuition. But in fact, intuition is really, it's signaling to us. It's not coming out of nowhere. What we're getting with intuition is our body starts to respond. You know, our pulse might quicken, our stomach might flip, the hairs may stand up on our arms because all of a sudden we just have this idea and that something's coming together for us. And what's happening is it's moving from the unconscious to the conscious brain, and we're suddenly, it's getting shape, and we're pulling it all together, and then our conscious brain is starting to really sort through these things that we've had. But long before we get to that place, our body is really good at telling us when something is either really right or really wrong, trusting in our body to really inform us when something is not feeling good and we need to make a decision around it, or when something feels like it's a great option and we need to capitalize on that situation as quickly as possible. As we talk more about intuition and we talk more about mindfulness, and we'll address those issues together to some extent, you're going to notice that mindfulness is going to be an important part of being able to tap into our intuition. It's also an important tool that we need when we have very little known information in front of us, yet we still are being forced to make a decision. We've got to rely on our intuition. We've got to be mindful, present, quiet to the noise, and really sort of see things with different eyes. And we'll get to some of that analogy in a little bit. Well, we've talked a bit about how individuals make decisions. Most of the time we are working within groups to be able to make decisions, and we'll spend a class addressing different ways we make decisions within groups. There are pros and cons. Not every decision should be made by a group, so hence the comment, are more heads really better than one? Well, why or why not? Sometimes it is important to have multiple perspectives of individuals focusing on a project. You get more creative outcomes, you're more likely to address problem-solving issues, but here's the challenge. It takes more time, it takes more training. People tend towards risky decisions, as you can see from the graphic in the middle there. Groups will tend towards a risky shift because responsibility is dissolved and it is spread out amongst all the team members. And because we have greater emotional bonds with our team members, our anxiety goes down. So we are willing and capable of accepting more risk than any one of us individually would be willing to do on our own. So the group it's sort of this collective shift upwards in the risk that people will take. So there's more risky decisions. We're more likely to experience things like groupthink, although there's some debate as to whether or not groupthink actually occurs. I think fundamentally there's lots of problems individually, whether or not you agree that groupthink exists. Individually, there are all sorts of examples of how some of the symptoms that people argue are part of groupthink are individually bad enough as they are. And we'll get and talk about that more when we get to our module on group decision making. And then lastly, of course, there's more conflict. We definitely see a situation where conflict is more of a problem because we have differing opinions and we have more challenges, which on the one hand is great to have different opinions, but to have the conflict is a problem. And the best thing that we can do in terms of managing groups and group decision making is teaching people how to deal with conflict resolution and how to negotiate and how to respect others' opinions and to learn how to talk through those. And so while I introduce these concepts here, when you get to the next class, MBA 523, you start learning how to put these tools to practice. You learn how to negotiate. You learn how to manage the conflict. You learn how to see the world from someone else's point of view and work better towards better agreements. The decision-making risk continuum is a great illustration of how we go from certainty, where everything seems to be known, we know the goals, we know the alternatives, we know the outcomes, and from that we can make a very easy programmed decision, very much like the rational economic model that we talked about a few slides ago. But as we have less and less information, as you can see from the points in red, we have under a decision made under risk, we're not clear about what outcome is going to happen. We may have some probabilities of this might happen, but we don't know for sure. Whereas in a situation where we're making a decision under certainty, we know what the outcome will be. If we do this, A will happen. If we don't do this, B will happen. With risk, it's not clear. It's possible it might happen, but it might not. And we don't have, it's a sort of a shifting, moving, target. We're not really clear, what the outcomes will be. As we move up and we have more and more missing information, now with making a decision under uncertainty, we might know what our goals are, but we might be looking at a circumstance where we're not really clear what the alternatives are because we don't have enough information, and we may not have all the information we need. And this is where, in this circumstance, when we're making decisions under uncertainty, and certainly in the next category, when we're making decisions under ambiguity, we have to really start tapping into our intuition and really seeing things with different eyes. Because when we allow ourselves to only be limited to a small vision in front of us, we will be handcuffed under those circumstances. So learning to be mindful, learning to tap into intuition, allowing ourselves to really see what's there and what's not there is going to be a big part of that. Lastly, of course, decisions under ambiguity. Imagine that you're in a crisis situation, and that's really what we're going to talk about as we get to our last lecture on decision-making under ambiguity and decision-making under crisis. Is we're not sure. I mean, I can tell you my own experiences, being in New York City on 9/11 and seeing buildings falling and people jumping from buildings and airplanes hitting buildings and not knowing what was going on, why it was going on. I didn't know what the goal was because I didn't know what was even, why things were even happening. So we had to assess the situation. We still weren't clear why it was happening. We didn't know whether to run classes or to not run classes. Who even knew that the buildings were going to fall? All we knew is things were changing very quickly, and we had to react to the situation. And so that's a very ambiguous situation. Many crises are exactly that. When the crisis first occurs, it's very ambiguous. We aren't clear about the goals. We're not clear about alternatives because we don't even know what's going on in the first place. So there's no way you can come up with outcomes if you don't know where you're at. So we move from making decisions under uncertainty and ambiguity, and really what we're talking about is how to manage the unexpected. How do we prepare for the unexpected? By definition, because it is not something we plan for. It's unanticipated. Can you plan for something that you don't anticipate, that you didn't even know was going to occur? Did anybody think that they needed to plan for the Boston bombing, during the Boston Marathon, or, the World Trade Center towers collapsing? How do you manage that? How do you be ready for that? As you saw from the video clip, the Did You Know clip, things are changing rapidly. And if things are changing that rapidly, our biggest challenge is how do we catch up? How do we make changes appropriately? How do we adapt to the speed at which things are changing? And that's where managing the unexpected becomes the the focal point for a lot of decision nowadays. More and more decisions are made in that realm of the unexpected and the unanticipated and the ambiguous. And so the tools that I want to teach you guys is to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet, to assess the situation, and to try to make a decision as quick as possible in that circumstance. This next slide deals with the 3 C's of decision making: constructive conflict, consideration, and closure. And all 3 of these are either things to engage in or things to be careful with. For example, in the closure issues, we don't want to decide too early or too late. We want to make sure we have just the right amount of time to be able to make the decision, taking longer when we need to and a shorter amount of time when it's less appropriate. For example, in a crisis, or when we're things have to move quickly. Constructive conflict, starting there, is about making sure that we allow for debate. Debate's good. Conflict in a small c is fine. It's when we get to a higher level of conflict where we find it's dysfunctional, that people are fighting with each other, they're not listening to each other. That's more of the problem. What we want is constructive criticisms. We want to have good debate. We want to make sure we don't make people feel defensive. We don't want to use terms like "you're stupid" or "that idea was dumb." We want to make sure that people who tend to create coalitions, right? This is not all Survivor. We're not playing Survivor, we're playing business. And when we get people to start working in little groups and coalitions, and they start working against the other group, that's going to create a problem when it comes to having rigorous, vigorous, appropriate debate about issues. So we have to be careful to not let these coalitions develop. And so the goal is, as a leader, is you want to divide those natural coalitions up so that people are spread out all over the place, enabling them to not have an economy of scale, if you will, having them all together in one group, and suddenly they have more voice than everybody else. We want to get people out of the old way of doing things. Well, we've always done it this way. This is the way we've always done things. Well, the world is changing, as we saw from that previous slide. Did you know? Because it's changing, old ways of doing things aren't going to work anymore. We have to make sure we bring an open mind to how to deal with this. And also, again, challenging these participants who are very stalemated to think about information. Are we thinking about it the same way? Are we thinking about it appropriately? When you're stuck, it's always important to go back to the beginning and rethink all the assumptions that you had. Maybe those assumptions are wrong. Maybe the assumptions need to be different. Maybe someone should have said something and they didn't, and now when you go back and revisit that key information, they feel more open and capable of expressing their concerns with the way things were headed. In terms of the second step, consideration, the idea is we want to give people appropriate consideration for their interpersonal behaviors. We want to make sure that we're listening actively, that we are open, not defensive, but open and to what people have to say. And importantly, when you are the decision maker, we need to make sure we are clear about the rationale behind our decision. That adage of, because I said so, which, our parents, and I even use it myself as a parent, but, the thing that our parents would tell us when we were growing up, because I said so, so therefore you should do it. It just doesn't work in the business organization. These are adults with opinions of their own and ideas, and we need to respect that. You may not agree, but you certainly owe them an explanation for why things are done the way they are. If you go in it as you're omniscient and only your opinion works, that's going to be much more of a problem. You're not going to garner the respect of your employees when you do that. And then lastly, the closure issue. We want to be careful, as I said already, not making decisions too fast. For example, using a directive style when it's not appropriate, or making it too late, i.e. using a analytical style when it's not appropriate, when really we need to make decisions faster. So we've got to find where that sweet spot is in terms of how much information we can gather in what amount of time, and when is the key point to be able to make that decision.